France is a country with many famous cheeses. There is a good chance that you can name at least 3 French cheeses right now. And there's an equally good chance that one of those cheeses is the one we're looking at today, France's best known blue cheese. Let's learn about the history of Roquefort. Hey there cheese historians, I'm Julia and welcome to Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history and impact of cheese. Today we're looking at the history of Roquefort, one of the best known and loved blue cheeses in the world. In this video I'm going to begin by looking at the claims that Roquefort dates back to either Roman times or to the reign of Emperor Charlemagne. I will then turn to the town of Roquefort-sur-Soulzon where Roquefort is made to see what we know about the cheese making in that area and how Roquefort became the world-renowned cheese it is today. I will end by exploring what it is that makes Roquefort distinct from every other blue cheese made around the world. As we're looking at another French cheese, I'd like to apologise in advance in case I butcher any French words or place names in this episode. I try, but I'm not always successful. So with that out of the way, let's look at what we know about when Roquefort was first made. It is sometimes said that Roquefort goes back to Roman times based on a comment made by Pliny the Elder when discussing the different types of cheese available in the Roman Empire. The cheese of this kind, which is made at Rome, is considerably preferable to any other, for that which is made in Gaul has a strong taste, like that of medicine. Gaul in Roman times is more or less modern-day France and was incorporated into the Roman Republic by Julius Caesar. Not long after, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire and Gaul was part of that empire, and its cheeses were being shipped to Rome. I have an episode about the different cheeses of the Roman Empire if you're interested in that. The reason some people speculate that this cheese from Gaul that tastes like medicine is Roquefort is because, according to Pliny, it has a strong taste. Blue cheeses can be quite strong, so you can kind of see how they came to that conclusion. But I think it's a bit wishful thinking to conclude that this is Roquefort. Pliny doesn't tell us anywhere near enough to be able to say with any degree of certainty that this strong-tasting medicine-like cheese is Roquefort. There is evidence that cheese was made in the area around the town of Roquefort-sur-Soulzon since before the Romans. The tradition of cheese making in the area of the Larzac was certainly pre-Roman, the evidence being fragments of ficelles, the hold containers for straining and pressing the cheese. We can't say for sure, based on the containers the cheese was made in, what that cheese was like, so we can only say that Roquefort may date back to before the Romans, but probably doesn't. So was it around during the reign of Frankish Emperor Charlemagne? There are also claims that Roquefort is the mysterious cheese mentioned by Charlemagne's biographer, the monk Monika. Charlemagne was the king of the Franks and Lombards and emperor of the Romans in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. The cheese identified as Roquefort is also claimed by Brie, and I mentioned this incident in some detail in my episode on Brie, so make sure you check that out for the full story. Link up here. In brief, Charlemagne stops for the night at an unnamed place. As it's a Friday, the emperor won't eat meat, and the local bishop has no fish to serve the emperor, but does have some local cheese. The cheese is a little unusual in that it has a skin on it, or crucially for those who claim this is Roquefort, bits of mould through it. The emperor begins cutting away the skin, or picking out the mould, until the bishop gently informs him that he is discarding the best part of the cheese. Charlemagne tastes it and falls in love with it, insisting that the bishop send him regular supplies. It's worth pointing out that Monika, Charlemagne's biographer, was born over 20 years after Emperor Charlemagne died, so was not an eyewitness to this event. There are also a lot of details left out of this event that would be really helpful for identifying the particular cheese. The point of contention regarding the cheese in the story is whether Charlemagne was picking out bits of mould or cutting the skin off. According to Paul Kindstedt, the translation of picked out the mould is countered by at least 3 recent English translations that have variations of cut off the skin in its place, reducing the chances of this cheese being some sort of blue cheese. I'm always a little bit cautious about basing anything purely on the differences between translations, so if anyone does know where to find the Latin text of Notke's work known as De Carlo Magno or Gesta Carli Magni, I would be really interested in figuring out why there is such a difference between the translations here. I have looked high and low but can't seem to find it available anywhere. If this cheese is a blue cheese, then I find it strange that the bishop would tell Charlemagne that the mould throughout the cheese is the best part of the cheese. Because blue cheese can taste like blue cheese whether the blue mould is visible or not. I've made several blue cheeses myself where the mould didn't end up growing in the gaps inside the cheese, but they all tasted like blue cheese. Contrast this with brie, where the white mould on the surface does have a noticeably distinct taste compared to the rest of the cheese. Also, as blue mould can appear throughout a blue cheese, Charlemagne would have had a long and tedious task ahead of him to pick out all the bits of mould from the cheese. Dinner may well have taken several hours longer than normal. Brie doesn't have this problem as the white mould grows on the outside, and cutting it off would be more straightforward. So if I had to choose between Roquefort and brie as to which makes more sense within the story, I would have to go with brie. However, that doesn't mean that the cheese in the story has to be brie, just that it is more likely than Roquefort. Kindstedt argues against interpreting Charlemagne's cheese either as brie or Roquefort, remarking that such speculation clearly involves a leap of faith beyond what can be gleaned from the text. However, it is not uncommon to find unsupported statements, and even outright myths concerning cheese history in popular works on cheese. Though entertaining, such myths sometimes take on very high stakes when they are used in marketing and promotional campaigns, or to justify the awarding of special legal status to specific groups of cheesemakers, as in the Protected Designation of Origin program in the European Union. Ouch. I think that it's a fair criticism though. One of the things I have come across repeatedly when researching for the episodes on this channel are claims made about the origins of those cheeses or when they were first made without any mention of where those claims come from. It is incredibly annoying and time-consuming to figure out whether there is any truth to them or whether they are just regularly repeated myths with little or no substance behind them. If you would like to know about a cheese that has spent its entire history being cleverly marketed and having its origin story promoted as historical fact, check out my video on Camembert. All this is to say, Roquefort is unlikely to be the cheese mentioned by Charlemagne's biographer, but I do wish he had mentioned where the emperor was at this time. Then we would have a better idea of what this cheese was that he liked so much. However, as Notke was writing many years after Charlemagne had died, it's always possible that he didn't know where this took place either, and was just retelling a familiar story about the emperor. Myths aside, what do we know about the history of Roquefort? Roquefort-sur-Soulzon is the small village in the south of France that is the home of Roquefort. There is evidence that cheese has been made in this area since before Roman times, but it is much harder to say for sure when Roquefort was first made. However, there was cheese being made in Roquefort-sur-Soulzon and aged in caves almost 1,000 years ago. The first definite mention of Roquefort cheese dates from 1070, when a charter confirms the donation of a cave and a farm by the Seigneur of Cornu to the great abbey of Conques. The gift marked the beginning of a phase of expansion of manufacture, during which the monks encouraged their vassals to improve their techniques, and a number of religious houses owned caves, in the Rue des Caves, at Roquefort itself. The production of cheese developed not only for external exchange purposes, but also for the payment of rents. One cheese was taken from each lot transported to the caves for maturing, to be devoted to local expenses and the maintenance of the castle, which was a defensive outlier for the city of Melun. The Abbey of Conques is in Aveyron, and the village where Roquefort is made is around 100 kilometers to the south of the Abbey of Conques. So we can date the cheese produced in Roquefort-sur-Soulzon and aged in caves to the 11th century. We don't have much to go on when trying to figure out what this cheese was like. As this cheese was being aged in caves underneath the town, it suggests that it's a firmer cheese that is able to be aged. We can assume that if this is not a blue cheese at this point, it is a predecessor, and that before long the cheese would become contaminated with blue mold and make something like Roquefort. As cheeses don't always stay the same for hundreds of years, it's likely that if this 11th century Roquefort is a blue cheese, it could well be very different to the Roquefort made today. It could equally be very similar. There really isn't that much to go on. It seems that the monks of the various monasteries who owned caves in the Roquefort-sur-Soulzon area worked with their tenant farmers to improve the cheese made. If you want to know more about the connections between monasteries and cheese making, check out my video on that here. In the 11th century, two new religious orders, the Templars and the Cistercians, gained a monopoly over the grazing lands where the milk for making cheese in Roquefort-sur-Soulzon came from. They also controlled the supply of salt, which is an important ingredient for making cheese. Cheese without salt is very bland, and the blue mold that makes blue cheese blue likes a bit of salt. Not too much, of course, but salt helps the blue mold grow well, so is important for making good Roquefort. It's quite likely that all the connections to these Christian religious orders helped Roquefort gain a market beyond its local area, as at the time the religious orders had a great deal of influence. By the 15th century, it was obviously well known to French royalty, when in 1411, King Charles VI of France declared that only cheese made in Roquefort-sur-Soulzon could be called Roquefort. This ruling was confirmed again in 1666 by the Parlement de Toulouse, with fines for anyone caught selling fake Roquefort. Today, Roquefort is still a protected cheese with protected designation of origin status in the EU, only being made in the Roquefort-sur-Soulzon area. Denis Diderot and Jean Léron de Alembert published their encyclopedia, or a systematic dictionary of the sciences, arts and crafts, between 1751 and 1772. In this encyclopedia, Gabriel François Venel mentions Roquefort while talking up the cheese of France. Several of the kingdom's regions produce excellent cheeses. Roquefort is incontestably the best cheese in Europe. Brie, Sassenage and Marolles are as good as the best cheeses made abroad. The cheese from the mountains of Lorraine, Franche-Comté and the surrounding areas are perfect imitations of Gruyère. The cheese of Auvergne is as good as the best cheese from Holland, etc. It must have been quite a blow for Roquefort when, in 1814, Brie was named the king of cheeses during a contest at the Congress of Vienna. I haven't been able to confirm whether Roquefort was in the running for the title during this dinner party contest because I haven't been able to find a list of all 60 cheeses that were entered. But if it was, I dare say Venel would not have been pleased. I mean, he died in 1775, so he never found out. But still. Roquefort was seen as a luxury cheese until production began to increase in the 19th century due to selective sheep breeding enabling the milking season to get longer and the sheep to produce more milk. Railways and better sea transport also meant that the cheese could be exported around the world and could meet the demands of migrants who moved to the United States. But what is it about this small village in southern France that makes such world-renowned cheese? I mentioned in my video on the origins of blue cheese that the mold, or more technically the fungus, that is used in blue cheese is called Penicillium roqueforti. Roquefort uses Penicillium roqueforti, and the cheese is the reason Penicillium roqueforti is called Penicillium roqueforti. I mean, it's right there in the name. Traditionally, the Penicillium roqueforti is harvested using bread, usually dry, dense rye bread. The bread would be left in the caves where the cheese is matured for about a month until it has grown lots of mold. The powdery mold is then used when making the cheese. It's added during the cheese making process either to the milk before it's curdled or to the curds while they're being cut and stirred. However, these strains aren't the standard strains that any cheesemaker today can buy. They are specific to the Roquefort area, which is one of the reasons why the cheese has its own distinctive flavour. The caves under the town are very important for the production of Roquefort too, because the cheese has to be matured in these caves, otherwise it doesn't turn out right. In 1961, a court ruled that even if the ingredients and technique used to make the cheese were followed exactly by cheesemakers elsewhere, only cheese that matures in the natural caves under the village, the caves of Montcombalou, can be called Roquefort. This is not without reason. Inside the Montcombalou caves, the circulation of air and humidity trapped in the rocks creates a unique mold-growing environment. The natural cellars are 4 stories below the village, 100 feet or more deep in the rock. It is cold and humid in the caves, and the rock walls, the old hand-hewn wooden beams, and the wooden shelves where the cheese aged are all wet and slippery. The rocks show a kaleidoscope of colourful moulds and lichens, and this is essential to making Roquefort Roquefort. The cellars are centuries old, and attempts to create new cellars always fail. Caves are fascinating environments for aging cheese. Before the invention of refrigeration, caves were the ideal place to age cheese, as they have a naturally consistent, cool, humid environment, the sort of environment that cheese ages well in. The caves under Roquefort-sur-Soulzon have natural ventilation as well, in the form of fissures in the rock called fleurines. Air flows through these fissures, picking up moisture and cooling as it travels into the caves. When it gets there, it keeps the caves cool and moist, encouraging the blue molds to grow and spread throughout the cheese. But the Penicillium Roqueforti mold may not originate from the caves themselves. A recent study, which I go to in more detail in my video on the origins of blue cheese, link up here, argues that the mold first contaminated either the milk or the curds while they were being processed from the environment, either the animal's food or the rye bread, and are not in fact native to the caves. The mold is harvested from the caves using bread because the caves are filled with maturing Roquefort, which already contains Penicillium roqueforti. The mold spores are also happy making a home in bread, so they will colonize the rye bread left for exactly this purpose. So the specific location where Roquefort is made is important for how the fully aged cheese tastes, because it means that the local strands of blue mold growing on the cheese maturing in the caves can be harvested using rye bread and added to the next batch of Roquefort, which then matures in the ideal maturing environment of the caves. The other thing that makes Roquefort distinctive is the milk that it's made from. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is that Roquefort is one of the few really well-known cheeses made with sheep's milk. Sheep don't produce a lot of milk, particularly not when compared with cows, which is why there are not very many sheep's milk cheeses made at scale today. Luckily for Roquefort, it became popular before it was possible to produce cheese at an industrial scale, and it has remained popular despite not being produced at the same scale as, say, cheddar. Specifically, Roquefort has to be made from the milk of Lacoon sheep, who produce milk for around 7 months of the year. Milking begins in December and carries on until July, making Roquefort a very seasonal cheese, only being made during this time of the year. The milk is also never pasteurized, and this is one point that the makers of Roquefort refuse to budge on, even when they come up against countries that don't allow the import of raw milk cheeses, like Australia and New Zealand. Roquefort always seems to be the exception, and is the exception in both countries. After all, by all accounts, it is an exceptional cheese. If you enjoyed learning about the history of Roquefort, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss out on whatever cheese or cheese history topic I decide to do an episode on next. An extra special thank you goes to all my patrons over on Patreon. Your support helps me get access to more resources and information on cheese history so that these episodes can keep getting better and better. If you'd like to become an official cheese historian and support what I do, please do head over to Patreon. And I will see you around, cheese historians!